Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links video. Today what I wanted to do was talk about my thoughts, feelings and opinions about the state that Rush Duel Links is in right now. Talking about the positives, the negatives, has the game drastically improved since release? Because on release, a lot of people did come over to try the game out. They found it to be a little bit too simplistic. There wasn't really any spells or traps at that time. A lot of people fell off it quite hard, and a lot of people started really disliking the Rush format because of that. Now, I will say there have been many products released into Rush Duel Links, and some of them have been quite good, some of them have been quite bad or not really affected the game in a particularly positive way. But what I want to do is talk about the game as it is right now. Do I think the game is worth your time? Do I think the game is worth your money? Is the game fun? Etc, etc. So why do I want to do this video now? Well, Rush has been a mode in Duel Links for nearly 2 years now, so I thought this would be a good time to talk about it. Worlds is right around the corner, and that's like the big premier competitive event. Now obviously this event is only really for 8 people. Only 8 people are going to be playing the Worlds format, so it's not super exciting from like a player-based perspective. It's more of a spectator sport, but it's going to still be really fun nonetheless. And we have just had Shiny Shady put into the game, which is a really powerful trap card. And this is something people have been asking for a long time. And Shiny Shady is technically more interaction. It's exactly what people have been asking for. And it has sort of accomplished what everyone wanted it to do, which is sort of slow down the game, stop OTKs being super prevalent and games just ending really quickly, and allowing games to feel a little bit more like good play is rewarded. And that is something I think Shiny Shady has managed to accomplish. Now, quick disclaimer. I have been playing this game for 2 years, so I am going to have a decent chunk of sunk cost fallacy, so take what I say with a pinch of salt. On top of that, I'm also going to be a bit biased because I make videos like this one you're watching now. I also stream this game. I play this game with a lot of my friends, enter lots of tournaments. I'm really ingrained into the community. So again, I'm going to be very biased. So again, take what I say with a pinch of salt. And last but not least, and probably most importantly, just because I criticize something doesn't mean I hate it. Just because I say there's something I don't like about the game, that doesn't mean I hate that about the game. It doesn't mean I hate the game. It just means we're being critical. I think it's very important to, when you think there is something negative or when you think there is something that needs to change or you would like to see change, it's important to talk about it, because if you don't, nothing is ever going to change. So the first thing I want to talk about is the meta. And typically there are 3 things I look for in a good meta. I think it's always important to reiterate these in case someone hasn't seen any of the videos where I talk about it, and because it's really important everyone's on the same page. So what I specifically look for is good deck diversity. So ideally we want at least 5 decks that are tournament viable. Now that doesn't mean we have to have 5 tier 1 decks, but ideally across like tiers 1, 2 and 3 you want to see around 5 decks. I think 5 feels good, because every number lower than 5 I consider the meta to be much worse and worse, right? If we're in a 1 deck format, that's pretty bad. If we're in a 2 deck format, that's also really bad, but it's better than being in a 1 deck format. I think 5 feels about right. You can get away with 4. I think that good players should feel like they're being rewarded for making good plays. Games should not just really come down to coin flips, and ideally the stronger decks, the more powerful decks, the tier 1 decks are going to be harder to play than the tier 2 and tier 3 decks. Therefore you get rewarded for playing a more challenging deck. And last but not least, back and forth gameplay. The less OTKs the better, and ideally games should last several turns. Nothing feels worse than when you queue into a game and then the game is over in 2 or 3 turns because you just get OTK'd out of nowhere. So if we take a look at the current meta, deck diversity is fine. It could be better, but we're not in a bad spot. For the most part, I would say there are 3 very standout decks, being Light Galaxy, Elemental Hero, and Spellcasters. But just below that, I would say Red Boot is right around there, and then just like slightly lower than that would be things like Metarion, Jointech, and Baseball, and maybe Dark Galaxy. So it's a decently sized meta in terms of I think any of those decks can be competitively viable to take to a tournament. Realistically, Light Galaxy and Heroes are just stronger than everything else. Spellcasters are a little bit lower down, Red Boot's a little bit under that, and then the rest of the decks are all under that. So you could make the argument this is a 2-deck format, you can make the argument this is a 3-deck format, a 4-deck format. Whichever you decide is sort of up to your own interpretation of the meta, but I think at the moment, again, the diversity is fine. It's not fantastic, but it's fine. Some of the top decks do require some thought to pile up optimally. So currently what we do see is that players constantly miss lethal and misplay on the ladder and in tournaments. So that tells us that because people are misplaying, that means you can misplay, and if misplaying is quite common, that means difficulty tends to scale with that. Now this isn't always going to be the case, but this is an assumption we can make, so we're going to consider this format as requiring at least a little bit of skill. Now again, things are going to get a little bit muddy because if you've been playing, for example, Light Galaxy for the last 3 months, well then you've already played the deck to death, you already know every single combo line, you know all the optimal plays, and you will kind of do them without even thinking. So by that metric, they might not seem like complex plays, but we do see players misplay on these decks, therefore the deck does require at least a little bit of thought to pilot. And with the introduction of Shiny Shady, games have become more interactive. Games have slowed down somewhat, and OTKs now have counterplay outside of just Draw the Legend Trap. But so all of those are positives to the meta, what about some negatives? So OTKs haven't really gone away, they've just gotten a little bit slower. So first off, if your opponent tries to OTK you and you just haven't opened one of your traps, so your Legend Trap or one of your 3 copies of Shiny Shady, that's assuming you're playing 3 copies, well, you're just going to get OTK'd anyway. In some ways, Shady has changed things drastically, but in others it's simply extended the length of games. A lot of decks will now attempt to perform their OTK and either win or get stopped by the trap card, then the turn passes and their opponent attempts their OTK. And then they will either win or get stopped by a trap card. You just keep kind of passing this back and forth. Players will now exchange like this back and forth until one of them runs out of traps and loses. However, players have now started playing more back row hate again, something that had been phased out of most decks outside of a few spellcaster lists. This has led to a shift in deck building practices, since now players are trying to fit in as many copies of Shady and as many copies of back row hate as possible, and adding in 6 additional spell traps can be quite difficult. Overall, I would say this has been a net positive, as players are now better able to stave off OTKs and not just get blown out of nowhere. So let's talk about some of the decks in the meta, and the big one is going to be Light Galaxy. So Light Galaxy has been slipping down in tournament performance over the last week. It's still technically the top performing deck, and it has been the best performing deck for 3 months now. Now is the only time it's starting to kind of have a bit of a chink in its armor. Light Galaxy is a fun deck that does require some skill to pilot optimally. The interactions and combo lines the deck has are actually fun to perform, and the deck does feel rewarding to play. It has been a meta powerhouse since the introduction of Eternal Galactica Oblivion back on the 9th of May, which was 3 months ago. It has been unquestionably the strongest deck in the game, potentially in a tier of its own throughout its time in Duel Links, and is only now starting to share tournament results with Elemental Heroes. The deck has been around for so long now that players are getting frustrated with it. Players are getting bored of playing the same deck over and over and over, and players are getting fed up of losing to this obviously overtuned deck, especially over the course of 3 months. The issue as I see it is that Konami released Light Galaxy Fusions, Dark Galaxy Fusions, and the Charmy Spellcaster Fusions very early to build some hype for the World Championship qualifier, and by extension, the World Championship itself. Eternal Galactica Oblivion is the anime protagonist boss monster, and thus would be ideal to showcase at the largest event of the year. This in itself isn't an issue, but when the results of the World Championship qualifier saw 72.8% of deck lists in the top 100 playing Light Galaxy, and then they receive a slap on the wrist during the following ban list, while Dark Galaxy, which only made up 14.9%, got substantial nerfs, it tends to feel a little bit tone deaf. This feels even worse when you compare it to the last Goha Rush Festival, where Gaia Metarion made up basically 100% of the top 100 decklists and received a similar slap on the wrist, not receiving substantial hits until a month later, which overcorrected and basically killed the entire deck. I personally think that Gaia was very similar to Light Galaxy, in that the deck was fun to play, but clearly overtuned and outstayed its welcome as an effectively tier 0 deck. If the deck had its skill changed to forcibly remove the Metarion package, I think the deck could have stuck around for a while longer, although it probably would have still been massively overshadowed by the 3 big new fusion decks. In a similar way, Light Galaxy feels like it deserved harsher nerfs, either to the skill to stop them from plussing, such as forcing them to shuffle a card back after using the skill, or simply harsher nerfs to the limits placed on the deck. In my original ban list prediction video, I said that I wanted to see Light Galaxy receive a limit 1 to keep them off of using powerful staples like Compulsory Evacuation Device and Pot of Greed. My candidate for which was Extra Plasma, and 2 limit 3s to again force them to remove some key consistency pieces. Again, my suggestions were Star Troleo and Galactiara Eve. 2 cards that when combined with Secret Order would really have players considering their options during deck building. Instead, we saw Klein get hit to 3, which basically just meant most players took this 1/3 of out of their deck, and basically nothing changed. It always feels like Konami has their own ulterior motives for hitting and unhitting cards, such as wanting to sell new product, which means newer cards tend to be left alone, as well as higher rarity cards also being much less likely to be touched if they're from a box. But it feels like Light Galaxy has an extra layer of protection, that being the World Championship coming up, and Konami wanting it showcased there. Next up, I want to talk a little bit about Elemental Heroes. So E-Heroes seem to be the biggest winner of the latest deck build box, seeing the highest win rate increase in tournaments. The deck hasn't really seen much innovation outside of the introduction of Shady, but it is one of the only decks that can reliably force your opponent to use their Shady, along with Light Galaxy and Join Tech, thanks to their Burst Wingman. Heroes are more than happy to play a slower control game if they have to, using Burst Wingman to pick apart the opponent's back row or sitting behind their own trap cards until the path is clear and they can go for the kill with a Shining Flare Wingman or 2. This deck has been seeing a lot more play on ladder, which is something that cannot be said for Light Galaxy. Heroes being much more free-to-play friendly is probably the big reason for this, as well as Heroes being a beloved archetype from the TCG, Speed, and even just fans of the GX anime. But there is one deck that is seemingly even more popular on the ladder: Spellcasters. So casters have also shown a decent improvement in tournament results since the introduction of Shady. This is a deck that was already playing more trap cards than most, whilst also playing back row hate. So whereas other decks have had to make somewhat difficult decisions on what to remove, or even if they'll include the new cards at all, casters have basically gone on unchanged. They also have always struggled to OTK their opponents, and as such have felt like the black sheep of the meta. But now with the ability to stave off death for a few turns, they find themselves in a stronger position. And finally, I do want to talk about Red Boot. I think for some players, they will consider Red Boot as like the 4th best deck. For other players, they'll be like, well, the top 3 are very solidified, but the rest of them are kind of all over the place. Personally, I do think Red Boot has proven itself as the 4th strongest deck, but again, take that with a pinch of salt. Red Boot was already starting to see a drop in its tournament results even before the release of Forbidden Fantastic Show. But many players, myself included, had expected this deck to be hurt immensely by the introduction of powerful trap cards, especially when considering that this deck would typically be stopped by a single legend trap and in most cases lose the duel on the following turn. This has, however, not seemed to be the case. Although it is true that the deck is unable to OTK as much as it could previously, the Red Boot players have adapted and started to play more back row hate, allowing them to disarm some of those pesky Shadies some of the time, as well as using Curse of the Rising Light to gain some advantage after being a victim of a trap. This deck is still able to output a decent amount of burn damage and win the game over a few turns, provided they have their own traps to preserve their own life, so Red Boot, although not in the strongest position, is far from dead. So in conclusion, I do think that some of the stronger decks have been around for a little bit too long. We have effectively had Light Galaxy and Spellcasters be 2 of the strongest decks for about 3 months, and that does feel a little bit excessive. But since the introduction of those decks, I would argue that the meta has become more interesting. It has required a little bit more skill to pilot some of these decks. Deck diversity has been in a good spot. And now with the introduction of Shiny Shady and the number of OTKs dropping drastically, the game does feel like it is in a much better spot. So that is going to be it for the first part of this video. That's right, we're going to be having a second part where I'm going to be talking about some of the other aspects of Duel Links, specifically to do with Rush, that don't have much to do with the meta. So look forward to that video coming soon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.